Hey team, we're gonna give this another try. So I have a new setup, and the way that I'm set up right now, I'm hoping that you'll be able to see the entirety of my image the whole time. I'm still trying to figure out what's the best way to view what it is that I'm doing, and I think that the answer is two cameras. So hopefully I'll have that problem solved pretty quickly. This is the image that I worked on yesterday. This is the gardenia that we used a yellow-violet complementary color scheme to set up the values within the white petals. And we were really focusing on just really looking at those delicate values that are in here, those really thin lights, 10, 20, 30% lights, and then pulling those darker cast shadows underneath the petals for depth, and then really pushing our darks on the outside in order to get this white flower to pop. I think I could make it pop even more, so we're gonna work on that. I did start in graphite over here. Today I'm gonna start on this side, and I'm just gonna do, I think probably a little bit quicker gardenia using just my brush, no pencil to begin with, no graphite. And I do this a lot. I use my brush as my drawing tool in order to avoid having any type of graphite marks that make it all the way through to the end. Another thing that was brought up with my students as they were watching the video, thank you so much. So some really good feedback is that while I was working on these leaves, I was not focusing my camera on what I was actually doing. And I had sort of jerry-rigged like a necklace that was holding my phone, so I completely understand that I didn't quite have that focused on what I was doing at the moment. Darn it. Okay, so over here, I'm gonna look at this flower again, just sort of, they're gonna be like a yin and yang between the two of them. I've got a bunch of brushes in my water just because I carried them outside, and I'm gonna get them out of water and set them with my paper towels. I think my Sablette is the most like a pencil. So again, I'm working on Arches 300-pound cold press, 100% cotton paper. I'm using a combination of paints. I've got some Holbein, some Utrecht. I've got some Winsor & Newton. I think I've even got a Daniel Smith stuck on there somewhere. And I'm going to use this number 6 Sablette brush that I just really adore. And the closer I come in on the ferrule, on the metal part of this brush, the more control I'm going to have over these bristles, and that's when I can really use it quite a bit like a pencil and less like a brush, right? It's still going to have that flexibility because, I mean, we're still using the same tool. Do you guys see that I have a little spider joining me? He's been running across back and forth out here. These are the perks of working outside. All sorts of friends to join you, so hopefully he'll like the gardenia that we're working with here. I'm gonna do the exact same color scheme on this one so that we can see them kind of side by side. And then I am gonna try this, I think, one more time, and I'm gonna use more of a blue and orange. But right now, just to start with, I'm gonna start with some yellow. If you do your drawing with yellow, you can almost always assure that you're never gonna lose that lightness, right? So if I just start with a little tiny bit of yellow in here, and I'm looking at the center of my gardenia, and I'm just setting up a little bit of structure. So I'm using this more as a pencil, right? And I'm looking at the lines. So when I talk about watercolor being both a drawing medium and a painting medium, what I'm really talking about is line work, linear thinking in drawing versus thinking about form and shape, really truly more form and chunks of value when I'm painting. And so I know I'm biased, but this is like where I really believe that watercolor does such a good job of like so smoothly jumping back and forth from one to the other. And I'm working my way out from the center of the gardenia, and then I'm just gonna go one petal at a time, and I'm looking for connection points. And I've got a little bit of yellow. I picked a pretty cold yellow and I put a little bit of warm violet in it. So I'm ending up with this basically like light ochre color at the moment that I'm working with in order to set up my drawing. And I'm just going from one shape to the next, and I'm really looking at those contours. You know, so where are those lines that define the change in shape, the change of object? Where are they landing? And we're just going to run into a leaf over here, which will feel really natural, because I feel like these gardenias are always kind of these treats, you know, these little bits of treasure that you find inside of these gorgeous waxy leaves that are almost like citrus leaves in, I feel like, their weight. And so I'm just working around. Remember, when we're working from life, you know, I mean, I'm not technically working from life right now, right? I'm working from a photograph, but anytime I'm using source material that comes from reality, I'm using it as a guide. It does not need to be perfect. So if you feel like you're having issue with one petal not being absolutely what it should be, don't get hung up on that too much. You know, I think that as long as you're observing and you're not putting 35 petals where there should be 5, I feel like unless there are only 3 petals, right? If you're like focusing in on a bougainvillea or something along those lines, something so identifiable in its shape and its simplicity, you've got a little bit of wiggle room, because I always tell my students that no one sees your source material. You know, after you've set up your piece and you're working, that source material is, you know, a bit of a secret. It's between you and your piece at that point in time. And this source material, as I mentioned yesterday, is from Miss Barbara Danielson. And it's just a really nice portrait of this little gardenia. And I'm just working this kind of like what has turned into a bit of a brown, right? Because I'm mixing my complements. Yellow and violet are across from each other on the color wheel. And so they're going to perfectly dull each other. And if we all agree that there are only, you know, 3 colors that are visible to the human eye, red, yellow, and blue, then we can also agree that even if we're using yellow and violet, we're really just using yellow, red, and blue, because red and blue make violet. So you gotta have that sort of understanding of your colors, that there are only 3 of them. And that we use, you know, our primaries in conjunction with one another. Now, that being said, I don't know how to mix an opera pink. I can't make something that vibrant using the reds and blues that I have. I can come close, but I can't get it quite that neon. So that's a whole nother story of ultraviolet abilities and our new chemical capacity, right, to create colors, which is pretty amazing. So something I realized yesterday while I was working is that I kind of needed more time in my background. Like, I felt like I cut myself a little bit short in my drying time. So now that I have this flower set up, right, and I have all of these petals laid out using just my watercolor, no pencil, right? No pencil on this one. I'm actually gonna lay in my background now, and then I'm gonna come back in, work all of these values and shadows in this kind of like dingy violet, like my violet with a little bit of yellow mixed in to dull it down. And that'll give my background time to dry, and while it's drying, I can do a second pass. So right now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this just water, right? I just have water, and I'm going to kind of like blend these leaves into one massive thing. So I have a flat brush. Again, I have been misusing my flat brush. I'm currently working on a mural at my house using acrylic, and this is really the best liner brush. It just makes such beautiful lines in our acrylic. So I do have, if you're noticing, just a little bit of acrylic buildup on this brush, although I clean my brushes really well, even if I don't clean my palette really well, and I try and keep a brush for as long as possible, especially if it's a nice one. And this little 1/2-inch flat is something I've really loved because I guess it's technically a wash brush. It's got a little bit of a longer bristle on it, and the structure of the ferrule is really nice. And then it has this plastic, right? It has this acrylic handle, and then it has this back end that I can use for scratching out if I want to. And this brush just has a really nice weight. It's like really well weighted against the handle and the ferrule here. And so I've just made this wash out here with just water, and now I'm going to take a fairly cold, kind of limey green, and I'm going to drop in some really limey greens and then some really like distinct yellows. You know, I'm going to drop some limey greens in here, and I'm gonna bring some of this. Remember that if you put a color down somewhere, you want to make sure that it ends up somewhere else. So I'm gonna bring some of this really vibrant cold lemon yellow down here as well, so that I kind of have this distribution all the way across my composition, because now this is becoming one. And let's see, I feel like I've shifted just a little bit, but I think that that's gonna be good. Again, if you're using just primaries, make yourself 3 or 4 greens. Make one that's really nice and cold, like a phthalo that has a bunch of blue in it. Make one that's got some deep browns in it, right? So you're gonna pick a green that's got, and put a little bit of red in it in order to dull that. And here I'm just gonna make some leaf shapes, and I'm working pretty saturated. Right now I'm using a phthalo green that's got a little bit of like a lemon yellow in it, so a really nice cold yellow and a really nice cold green, and then I just dropped a little bit of brown in it as well. So now I've got some more to work with here, just another green to work with. I'm not filling in completely, right? You want to give yourself some breathing room, a little bit of space. This is going to be a very full composition. This is what I would consider an exercise, you know? This is not going to be most likely a finished piece, although you never know. So right now I'm just putting some indigo right down into here, and I don't know if you guys just saw that I sort of snapped my brush. I sort of hit it up against the edge of the petal because I was trying to keep it white, and in doing so I dripped 2 really dark bits of indigo right into my white flower. So I'm just going to lift those before they become a problem, because I want those nice subtle tones in there. So I don't want to have big drips, right, of indigo. That's no fun. So I am going to drop this in here though, just to push that value, bringing in a really nice dark blue in here. And you can really see it spreading out into that wet fiber, right? Remember, when you open up that fiber, you're opening it up to accept more pigment. And so you're just preparing your paper for what you're about to give it. I'm just going to take some of this color while I have it on my brush back into the work that I did yesterday. I'm always surprised that even between day 1 and day 2, my marks can be so different. You know, I always think of them as being so consistent, but the truth is the time of day and you know, the last time I ate and the kind of mood that I'm in, all these sorts of things can affect the type of mark that I'm making. So I'm just gonna pull a little bit of today's mark into yesterday's work so that I have that carryover from one day to the next, and I'm just gonna sneak a little bit more of this indigo right in here so that we get that nice pop along our lights in here, and hopefully that'll really bring all of that forward. So now I have this background, this sort of wash of colors that's laid in. I'm gonna drop a little bit more brown in there because I love when it dries with the blue and what it does to the greens, right? Especially if you pick a brown that's got a little bit more red in it. You can really dull some of your greens right in there, nice close to this image, you know, of the flower next to those lights. So you're really gonna be pushing those darks right behind your lights so that they can create the most amount of contrast. So just dropping a little bit of brown, you know, a little bit of dappling into that background in order to create those textures. And this is maybe that moment where, you know, you're thinking about, what about that unexpected color? What's that color that's not supposed to be there? And I'm seeing that we don't really have any red or like true orange in this composition. So I might sneak a little bit of bright red just down in here with this green. I'm just gonna put a little bit right in here. And I'm gonna put a little bit right in here, and I'm gonna sort of treat it as the edges of this kind of burnt leaf along here. And now that I've put it in 2 places, I should definitely put it in 3. So I'm gonna make a really strong triangle. I want that red over here as well. And in this kind of yin and yang composition, I think that that should work. So I'm just gonna pull that and drop it in where I want this little bit of burnt color right along there. Okay, so now I have some really good colors from yesterday coming into today. I have some marks from today coming into yesterday's work, and I'm gonna pop back to my Sablette. So I'm coming back to my number 6, and I'm gonna take a violet. You can either have a pre-mixed violet, or you can take a nice cold red like an alizarin crimson. You never wanna make your violet with a warm red because it's gonna basically turn brown. That warm red has yellow in it already, especially like a cadmium that's already leaning towards the orange side, right? As soon as you put some blue in there, you're gonna end up closer to brown than you would like to be. And then I'm just gonna take a little bit of yellow and mix it in with my violet so that I get this nice dull violet. And then I'm just using way more water than I am pigment, right? So I have a lot more water loaded up with my dull violet here than I did with any of my other colors, right? These are super saturated, lots and lots of color, very little water. Even though I laid that water down on the paper, it's just a really different relationship between those two. So I'm gonna look at the heaviest dark. And one of the things that was brought up when I had my students look at the video that I made yesterday painting this gardenia was the idea of cast shadows and core shadows. So a cast shadow is a shadow that is cast from one object down onto another. And if you think about it as your own shadow that falls down onto the ground, right, it just shows that you're a 3-dimensional being and that you block out light, and that the light that you block out, you know, then creates this shadow that falls down onto the ground plane. And the same with these beautiful thin white petals. If I just look at the cast shadows, you know, where is one petal allowing itself to block out light and then cast a shadow onto another petal. That's a true cast shadow. Then within the actual shadow form, right? So let's say you have the structure of a shadow here. There is a breakdown even within that shadow of value. And remember, value is relationship between light and dark, right? So you're going to have darker shadows and lighter shadows even within your light shadow. So I'm looking at the darkest shadow within here, and that becomes my core. And I really do think of it like the core of an apple. It's not always at the center. Actually, most times it's not at the center. But as you work your way into the shadow, you're going to find that core. And technically a core shadow is the darkest part of the shadow that you're looking at. So maybe you've taken a bunch of classes and you've drawn and you've painted and you know all about core shadows and cast shadows and all that good stuff. The very first time that I was ever really like thinking about a cast shadow and a core shadow was probably a sphere exercise in which you attempt to take a flat circle, right, and draw the value changes in order to create the illusion of a sphere, of a three-dimensional sphere. So that's when you look at the breakdown of light and shadow. So there's 6 main parts, and I will be putting together a sphere demonstration as well, but they exist in anything that's allowing light to fall on it. So you have your highlight. That's the area of your objects that's receiving the most amount of light, right? It is the highest level of light. And those highlights, often in shiny objects are sort of glistening and glaring, and in watercolor we oftentimes leave them out as the white of our paper. All highlights really. I'm talking about the little glint in your eye that you see, or in anyone's eye. We're talking about the light hitting this gardenia here and having some really poppy white highlights that really must stay the white of the paper in order to show where the light source is coming from. And then when you move from the highlight, you move down into the light. And the light area is the area of your object that is still receiving light and kind of sort of what I would say free of shadow, right? It's not the highlight. It's starting to have a little bit of a relationship with the shadow, but very little. Maybe you're at like a 10%. And then as you add more value, you're moving into a true shadow portion. And then from your shadow, you're moving into a core shadow. And then your core shadow is that darkest part, the area of your object that's receiving the least amount of light, so it's receiving the most amount of shadow. And then the final part would be the reflected light, and that's where, especially in a three-dimensional object that is round like a sphere, that your light is moving back. Your object is moving back towards the light. Or you're getting that reflected light off of the surface that it's on, often a table when you're doing still life drawings. And in here, if you've been watching me, I'm just setting down my values. So anytime I see a dark value, that's where I've like reloaded my brush and I'm going back in, and then I'm kind of I'm sort of treating where I set my color down as my well. Right? So I'm never smushing, right? I'm always just barely touching my paper, just dropping on my pigment. I'm not ever scrubbing it or pushing it around too much. With watercolor, you can really damage your paper, right? You can really scar your paper. So you just want to think about just dropping that pigment on and letting it do its own thing. And in here, even within these light values, and remember this is going to dry up lighter than we're setting it down, we still want to stay pretty light because this beautiful white gardenia is just, it's just so delicate in its value changes. And you don't want to be too heavy-handed, but anywhere you do want those darks, so like right here along this edge, and then as this folds in and I've got a cast shadow in there on that side, I can lay down the heavier part of my pigment and then pull from it. And something I feel like I need to focus on is that idea that I was talking about yesterday, if you've watched that video, that your petals aren't just petals, right? They're not like little flat pieces of paper. They have a little bit of volume themselves. I'm seeing here along this edge that I've got this little turn of the petal, so just like that little note of volume right there, and it drops down into this darker shadow behind it. And I'm going to take a little bit of water and just pull that value through. And remember, we're working however you're thinking about it, either in towards the center of the flower or radiating out from the center of the flower. And this is way too heavy-handed out here, so we're just going to take our paper towel and do a quick lift out in this corner, but I don't want to lift anything from my background, so I'm just going to pick up some of that color. My goodness, that was way too heavy, way too heavy. All right, so we'll just bring a little bit more back down in here. Maybe one of the things you're wondering is like when you want to make really nice smooth value transitions. Something I will stand by is the answer is always water, right? So if you want a nice smooth transition, I've just laid down a little bit of water here, and my water's starting to get slightly dirty, so maybe you can see it a little bit. And I'm just going to drop my color along the edge and let it get pulled out into that little bit of water that I already set up. And then there's a really nice little shadow right here. And I'm just gonna follow along that. And there's some really good shadows right back in here. Separate these two leaves. They're not leaves, petals. And if you want, you've already laid down your pigment and you want that to smooth out a little bit more, you can just pick up a little bit of water and just run it along that edge and let that transition smooth through in there. So I feel like I'm in a pretty good place here on this pass, and I feel like what I want is a little bit more definition in here in the center. So I'm gonna pop a little bit more yellow, then I'm gonna take a little bit more brown and drop it in on either side where I see just some really warm brown shadows deep in there, and I think it might be the actual stamen in there that are creating those browns, or I don't know, it could be two little nesting bugs in there. And then I'm going to come through with just a couple of, I feel like, harsher transitions where I want to really define, like I love this hard edge here that's created by laying wet paint down on dry paper. But first let's do a little bit of that yellow. So I want a yellow. It's got a little bit of warmth. It's kind of like just right in the middle yellow. And I'm just going to put that right in here. So I'm just going to drop a little bit of that yellow right in here where it comes through. Maybe while I have this on my brush, I can pull some up into this sort of burnt leaf as well. So here I am laying a yellow over some pretty wild colors. So I'm never gonna have like a true yellow when I do that, because there's just all this other color underneath there, and yellow is such an interesting color. It's like weak and powerful at the same time. And then I want those two little bits of brown. So I'm going to I have a brown already kind of mixed up on my palette from doing the background earlier. It's a little bit of a red brown, like a little bit of red sienna, and a little bit of blue mixed in there. And then this rolls around, and there's these two little, and there's a little guy in here as well, and I'm not quite sure what they are, and I'm just going to use just that little bit of brown to help define the center in there. And I've got this nice brown right on my brush right now, so I can take that and bring it up here if I would like. I can take that same brown and just identify some leaves in my background if I want to, or maybe I'm seeing a little bit of branches or stems back there. It's pretty thick in that background. Just bringing a little bit of that brown throughout, looking at how it kind of needs to flow along this composition. I still don't know which way this piece is going to be viewed. I'll have to turn it around a bit, and I'm just going to take, following from this orangey red that we laid down, this really warm red, down into this brown all the way around. It catches a little bit of brown that I've already put there yesterday, and then I'm just going to bring a little bit of it out on this side as well to sort of carry that through my composition. And then I'm going to make some of those harsh lines that I just talked about. So I'm going to pick a slightly colder violet, so I'm just going to put a little bit more blue in it. So now I have a violet that has some yellow in it to dull it, and now I've pushed a tiny bit of blue into it just to take it one step colder. And so I'm just thinking about some areas that I want some definition. Again, I'm working from the center out. I just want this little turn in here to be more defined, because I'm getting picky. I just want this to have a little bit more. Here's a good core shadow right in here, where that's like the nice dark point of the shadow as it turns along this edge. Here, along this petal, it's got a really great dark edge where it's also turning. So looking at those planes as they change direction. Oh, that's way too dark, but I'm gonna leave it. I really like it. And then over here, I'm just gonna put a little bit more dark right along. And so I'm just trying to pop those whites, right? So if I can push the negative space, the shadow of the petal behind it, in order to create the white of the shadow, or the white of the petal in front of it. So this is what I'm talking about. If I make this back behind darker, then it pulls the lightness of the petal in front forward, right? So I can push and pull the depth of my petals with my darks, which is what I'm going to do in my background as well. And I can help to define edges that way. So anywhere where I feel like I'm losing an edge, I can just take that little bit of dark and drop it in there. And if I get too carried away and it's way too dark and it's sneaking out towards the edge, I can just lift it slightly there, and this just needs to be softened just a bit. What else do we need to do? Come along this line here. There's this funny little petal that I've sort of made into 2 or 3 petals. That's really just one. Push that dark right next to the center. There we go. Oh, and we need some separation right here. So the way that this dried down, or I should say dried up, right? It just needs a little bit more definition right in there. And then we can pull a little bit of that value from behind back out. And you might be saying, that's exactly where you lifted before because you felt like you'd gone too heavy. Sometimes just knowing that little bit of lift that was there to begin with, to take away the white of the paper and put a little bit of you know, pigment down, it just changes the whole game, right? Like, I don't know if everybody's gonna see it, but I'm gonna see it. I know that it's there. And we're making work for ourselves, right? I hope so. I hope that those of you who've been in quarantine and been experiencing just lots of time by yourself, or not by yourself, quarantined with a large family, that you're finding some real sanity and solace in painting. Making work has been really, really helpful to me during this time. And, you know, just looking at one flower for an hour or 2 hours or 3 hours can really change your perspective on what we're dealing with here and how beautiful this world is. So I'm just gonna pull a couple more darks in here. I like to have 3 passes. That's my favorite. I love when I have the white of the paper and a light and a mid-tone and a dark, right? So I'm leaving the white of the paper and then I'm doing 3 passes. That's when I feel like I'm really doing my best value work. And right in here, there's just so many great sort of folds and things that happen. And I just want to push that dark right in there. Over on this side, I've got a petal that dips down and then has this great shadow over here as well. I think I drew the same petal twice on this one, which kind of makes sense because I've gotten slightly lost in my shape. Maybe I was a bit hasty just jumping in, but again, nobody is gonna see my source material when they look at my final piece. They're not gonna be like, Corinne, that gardenia has one too many petals. That's just, that conversation I don't think is ever gonna happen. I could be wrong now that I've put it out there. Maybe you guys are gonna show me, tell me how silly it is that I've added this extra petal. It's possible. Little bit of striations out here. This guy gets covered up by this kind of burnt leaf that's over it, and then this little bit of shadow that's like falling down under into this dark in here. Okay, now I think we've solidified it. I think we've kind of rushed from not done to so close to done, and I'm gonna let that dry, and it probably needs like the tiniest bit of love in some other locations, but I want to switch to the background just so that we can really get a look at what's going on. So I'm gonna do just a quick check to make sure that everything's good on the recording end, and then I'm gonna start back here and add in some leaf lines over the top. So let's see. Everything's good. Gonna make a nice green. I want it to, again, have some blue. I mean, all greens have blues in them, but I want it to be a little bit more blue than it is yellow. And then I'm gonna bring a little bit of reddish brown into it as well to dull it just slightly. And then I'm gonna make another green. So let's say you make 3 greens. Maybe you made a ton of green the first time, and so you already have your 3 greens. I want one that's kind of limey, that I would describe as lime green. I want one that's pretty dark. Like, if you're starting with a phthalo, you can even put a little bit more blue in there, like a nice ultramarine or a cobalt, and then throw a little bit of like a reddish brown in there as well. So you're making a really nice deep green. And then maybe you have another green that's like either what you would describe as a Kelly green, like a St. Patrick's Day green, or maybe you want to go in the other way. Maybe you really want to push some of those darks, like you've got that great indigo, that deep blue, and you want to pull that forward. So I'm just gonna lift my palette up for a second so you guys can see. I've mixed these 3 greens. This one is what I would call lime. It's got a lot of yellow in it and just a little bit of green. This is my green that's phthalo and then has a little bit more blue added in, and then also a little bit more brown, just to tone it down, just to dull it, right? Because I picked a really red brown. You could put straight red in there as well. It's gonna do the same thing basically, right? And then over here I have like an indigo mixed with a phthalo. So this is a really dark, cold green blue. And I can tell that what needs to happen, oh, that's a horrible noise. I'm so sorry that I just made that like scraping noise of my palette. I can tell that what needs to happen is that I need to have a camera set on my palette so that I can switch over to it whenever I am working, and we'll get there, yeah? We will get there. Okay, I'm gonna take this super dark one and I'm gonna come right in along this edge and just get some really nice dark, just right next to that white that we've saved out as the white of our paper. And yesterday I did a big, I don't know, rant about why I don't like masking fluid. But if you are new to watercolor and you're like, how am I supposed to save out these little tiny whites? You know, this is a great time to practice with some masking fluid. So if you want to invest, a good bottle of masking fluid is like right around $13 to $15. You can spend more than that. You can spend $20 if you want to, but you don't need to. And basically it's like a resist, right? You lay it down first, and wherever you lay it down, it saves out the white of your paper. I always think about, like, the most effective use of it for me has been cat whiskers. Oh my gosh, just like really seeing somebody save out those little beautiful wispy whiskers. And then you can lay these big washes. As a class, we did like a really fun painting of a stormy sky over the desert, and there was this lone lightning bolt, and we laid our masking fluid down for that, and I felt like that was also really effective use of the masking fluid, because who wants to paint around a little tiny lightning bolt? But I don't ever want anything to stop me, right? I don't want the lack of a material to keep me from making work. So I'm just coming in here and I'm following around the edge with this really nice dark one, right? That's got like the indigo and the phthalo mixed together. And I'm going to do the same up here to define this burnt yellow leaf that's coming up over the edge. I'm just going to go right over those crazy orange colors that we laid down, that little bit of orange and red. And then I've got this great leaf that lifts up, and I'm going to drop some good green in there as well, and I'm going to put some more lime in here. But this really washy background that's almost like tie-dye, and then coming back in with lines that are super drawn, super controlled, it just makes for this great contrast, right? And I think that that's something that I'm always looking for in good watercolor work, in work that I strive to create, is this chaos and control, back and forth, so that I'm letting the water do what it's gonna do. And I'm also making the marks that I want to make, right? My drawn marks that are my marks, that feel like me. And here's one here where I can come in, and I've got that kind of like medium green mix on my brush right now, and I'm gonna skip these little light guys as a negative space, and I'm gonna fill in between and let them be the thin little veins that are running back behind in this leaf. So you can work backwards where you're laying down a big wash and then putting your dark over it. One of my favorite times doing that was painting bat wings. Oh, and I just lost a white. It's always hard when you lose a white you've held on to for this long. And again, I'm looking at the leaves that are in the image, right, that are in the source material, so that I'm like seeing that these are actually gardenia leaves, but I'm not putting so much into making them perfect. I'm just looking to make sure that I'm getting their basic shape and form down, because I don't want somebody who loves a gardenia to be like, oh my gosh, it was great until she got to those leaves and then it looks like she put oak leaves on there or something. So I still want to look at, what is the shape of the leaf? It's nice and round. It's got these great waxy, like highlights to it. It's got so much color variation. Living here in Phoenix, there's just so much heat that all of these plants have to contend with. And so seeing some heat damage on there, seeing like a little bug ate some of that, is, you just want that variation in there, that little like dappling that's going on. I'm just going to drop a little bit more green along this edge, really solidify that I've got a nice light next to a nice dark. Maybe I even want to pull the tiniest bit of green in between these two. I'm just using the littlest tip of my brush. This is why I love the Sablette, because it comes down to that true point, and getting that nice true point, I can get a line that I feel like is thinner than a line that I can get with, I don't know, a mechanical pencil. I mean, I can come in here, and if I get more and more control in here, right, I can come in and just barely touch my paper and just lay down the thinnest, smallest lines. That's when we're really drawing with our medium and no longer painting, no longer thinking about big swaths of value and color, but really coming in and making some lovely small marks. And hopefully they'll run in combination with those big painted marks, and we'll have some good things going on. I don't like this right here. I've got this weird little thing that fell on my paper. I'm going to sneak that up off of there. Then I'm going to grab that big dark indigo phthalo combo, and I'm just going to drop it in here and get rid of that and make this nice edge over here and kind of dapple it back along into. And if you're ever like, ooh, I don't know about that, drop some more water in there. Get some good blooms in there. Let the water do something that it wants to do and that you're not trying to make it do. And like, speaking of that, I think I've got an edge down here that needs to get softened up a little bit. So I'm just going to take a little bit of water. I'm just working in tiny little circles, just laying a little bit down through here. This could be a fun background to lay a bunch of salt in with as well to start with. And I'm just going to take a second, take a step back. I'm hoping that you can see what's going on here. I've got a little bit of light catching through here, so you've got some weird shadows on there. But I'm hoping you can see the difference between these two. This one, that's, in my opinion, far more controlled. It's got a lot of structure in it, right? Worked graphite on there. And then this one, a little bit looser, although still fairly controlled because I love using my brush as a pencil. I'm just gonna pull that down here. Like, I shouldn't be lifting my piece up and running it around while I've got wet paint on it. I have to stop, right? Because this is enough. We've filled the piece of paper. So here are my two gardenias, and again, this one's got the graphite to begin with, laid in a lot of basic values and petal structure there, and then here we just drew directly with the brush, mixed up a yellow with a little bit of violet in there to tone it down, just to dull it a bit. And this time over here I worked structure of the petals, 1, lay down a background wash, 2, come back in, add those secondary values in your petals, let this dry, and then come back to work over the top. And that's what we ended up with, 2 little gardenias. I hope that this has been helpful, and I'm really looking for feedback. So if there's something that's driving you nuts while I'm making these videos, or something that you would like to see, or you want to make a new request, I basically have a week to get my act together. It is May 18th, 2020, and I have classes starting next Wednesday. So thank you so much for your time and for your support, and I hope all of you are having a wonderful day and that painting is making you feel amazing, right? We all need to feel a little bit amazing right now. All of a sudden I see this right in here and I just want just a little bit of this indigo to kind of cut across and sort of fuse these 2 together, and then I can bring it down into here. And then I'm gonna have to, now that's such a harsh line, I'm gonna have to carry it out back behind this green as well. And I'm just gonna dapple my brush along there, here, here. I'll photograph this when it's dry and post it so you can see it as it dries up. You can tell that left to my own devices, I will cover this thing in lines, which is my favorite thing to do, whether they are drawn with a brush or drawn with pen and ink later. But I must stop or the entire piece will just be lines. Okay, take care. Thank you.